I have been listening to videos by Skeptical Waves and Logos Ex Machina Archive on Julius Evola. I have not deeply studied Evola yet, but I am on that journey. I would like to know whether or not he has a response to this statement. Jesus Christ, having opened the way to God, is both king and priest, and has removed the need for a king to be an explicit priest, as in a member or leader of the priest caste. To qualify, I do not mean that a king need not be pious, but he is not to make sacrifices as if he were a member of the priest class. Whether or not he publicly prays before a battle is not what I am looking into here. We will look back into the past to illuminate what I am talking about. Starting with Egypt, the pharaohs were priests and they were kings. Their function was very priest-like compared to the others on my gradient of Egypt, Rome, and Israel. They were the ones who brought the sun, they meaning Pharaoh. They sacrificed so that Ra may have the power to rise in the morning, and survive the journey in the underworld to rise the next day. He may have had priests, some of whom became as powerful as he was, but at no point were they the same sort of god-king as he was. Religion and the state were one without any caveat. The king held services, and the king led troops in war. The Romans were a step beyond them, away from priest-king. They were a religious folk, but oftentimes the people had neglected their sacrifices, and, after disasters, must make them anew. The Pontifex Maximus was called upon to do them, and to lead the priest class in general. But also the dictator or council of the year or any number of other important figures were tapped to do the honors, always chosen among the powerful men of the age and not their impotent rivals. Fabian comes to mind as one who turned aside on his hunt for Hannibal to perform those prescribed sacrifices. There are several Roman events that are worth discussing in this manner. Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, but he denied the crown given to him by Mark Antony 3 times while they celebrated the festival of Lupercalia. Octavian, that is Augustus, was emperor, but did not hold the title of Pontifex Maximus until Lepidus, a member of the Second Triumvirate, died. Numa may have set the main Roman rituals down, but they had their own ancestor rituals in Troy, Greece, and the surrounding non-Roman peoples, the last of which Numa himself was descended. Counter to Numa is Tullus, who was struck by lightning for not performing the necessary sacrifices to Jupiter. The leadership here is half in, half out of the priesthood. Fabian was not called to make sacrifices because he was a priest. He was a general who was called to act as a priest. Numa was a king, but before that, he was a student of the priests. Octavian was a learned man, but he took the position of pontifex and added it to the imperial titles not because he was holy, but because it was necessary for his position. Who could he give it to that would not be a rival? The emperors after him acted as priests, often did so in opposition to disaster or to persecute some hated minority or to aggrandize their own god complexes, not because of deep piety to the gods. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, their religion was as decadent and disconnected from the people as the empire itself was from vigor. For as complete a separation of priest and king as is reasonable for a society that believes in God and gods, let us turn to the biblical accounts. First, Adam walked with God. Even though man was separated from God after the fall, Cain and Abel still knew how to sacrifice to him. Then Noah led his family to build an ark through God's command. Abraham was led by God to Canaan. Here is where we first see, in the Israelite sense, the separation of priest from king. Abraham was a king, but is rightly called a patriarch. He had no cities, but he had many people under him, vested interests in the towns around him, wells, and he was treated with respect as a military power wherever he went. Consider some events in his life. Though he made sacrifice to God at other times, Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem, overrode him and performed the sacrifices for him during a public event after the war. Melchizedek is given much respect as a Christ figure and as a representation as Christ as high priest. Another time, Abraham intercedes before God for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He fails, but God preserves his relatives. Abraham's relationship with God is direct. They talk, and Abraham is visited by God. However, at times, his sacrifices are interrupted, either by angels, in the case of his son, or by Melchizedek after a victory over Tidal, king of nations. Abraham may sacrifice and so on, but his primary mode of worship is not as high priest, in the same way that Melchizedek was. It is of note that the Pharaoh and, during Abraham's son Isaac's time, the king of the Philistines, both knew of God as in Yahweh when they trespassed on Abraham and Isaac and took their wives. There was a spiritual nature there that neither was surprised by, and both of them obeyed and returned their wives without question. I do not think God took the form of Ra or Moloch for either. The relationship of Abraham as a man of God is unquestioned. Now, pushing forward to the kingdom of Israel, both united and divided. When the Israelites called for a king, God explicitly tells them they'll hate it. There will be wars and that they will be taxed. Before a king, they had a system of divinely appointed deliverers who saved them from their oppressors. They were not ruled by priests, but rather by quasi-magnates, if anything at all. No Levite had or has ever been king of God's people. Moses was rebuked whenever he acted as a king. He was God's direct servant and a member of the priest class. Even his brother was high priest and not him. Many people were killed attempting to take the high priest position from Aaron, including their own family members. Leadership of the nation was not leadership of their souls. Even the sacrifices ordered by Moses were performed by others. Saul was not a high priest, but was of the tribe of Benjamin, not a Levite. Wherever he acts apart from God's will, he is punished. Whenever he attempts to act as a priest and not just a king, he is punished. God was a real force in his life and has direct representatives, but Saul was not among them. Saul's kingdom was removed from his family because he did not obey the Lord. David, after him, called a man after God's own heart, was so because he understood his place before God. He sought God, and never demanded of God what was God's. He was imperfect, but when his mistakes were confronted, he humbled himself before God. He sang songs, but he did not perform sacrifices. He was never without a priest or a prophet at his side to do it for him. Solomon was a gray case. He built the temple and never forgot God, but he also fell away from God and sacrificed to the idols of his wives. He did not interfere with the priests, but he was told that his son would lose a part of the kingdom. Jeroboam, who took over the 10 tribes of Israel from Rehoboam, acted quickly not just to keep the kingdom from the Judeans, but to separate the religion of the 10 tribes from the right temple of Jerusalem. For that he started a great evil in his nation. He could not trust that God would preserve his position even with the priests separate from his nation, so he led the tribes away from the Lord. Consider Asa, who sacrificed before God in the place of priests and was struck by leprosy. God, from Abraham to Moses to David and beyond, separated priests from kings and punished those who defied his will. Now we come to Christ. His sacrifice was the fulfillment of the law set down by God all those years ago. When Jesus Christ died, the massive curtain that separated man from the Holy of Holies was rent. Man could approach God of his own volition. Rather than this being a new tradition that is created whole cloth, it is a fulfilled tradition. Every man, woman, and child is to have a relationship with God directly. In other words, I can pray to God for help. I do not need to sacrifice for God's help. There is no promise I can make. The sacrifice has been made. It is better than any I could make, even if I were a rich man with many cattle. God's need for man to pay for his sins is over. The relationship has changed. Those things that separated us from God can be overcome. This does not mean that the priest caste is useless or just materialist. I am saved apart from a priest's action. A sheep lives as a sheep, no matter what his shepherd does. We live in a world without shepherds. Do not knock their power over the common man's life in other ages. We need them to guide us spiritually. God remembers poor priests. This does not mean that the nation does not need a king, even as we need priests. It is clear that God knows how nations rise and fall, and while he prophesied the downfall of some and the rise of others, God lets them do as they please, and affects them as he pleases. Therefore, there needs to be a king of some kind. We cannot live as anarchy. L'État, c'est moi. The modern man does not understand why Christ sacrificed himself, or why God let him do so. They know the facts, but the deep magic and the deep learning is not there. Before Christ, we had no recourse to reach out to God than through priests and priest-kings, as described by Evola. The common man had to bring his sacrifice to have a relationship with God. He must have faith that the actions he is taking are the right and pleasing actions towards God. I do not think Evola understands the separation of man from God or its solutions. I do not know if he ever considered if God, that is Yahweh, is real. I have acted and spoken as if God was real because there is no other way to act in a civilization founded on God being real and involved with our lives. With this in mind, talk of non-Christian tradition, priests, and kings has little savor. If we had a non-Christian king rule over America, it might be said, why should I serve a man who has no divine right to rule? And what's more, does not even know the traditions of the ancestors? Does he not know he rules a Christian people and that Christ is their king? Who believes that to revive the spirit of men, we should seek and serve demonic old gods who are nothing more than men or ideas writ large? Odin does not speak, nor does Zeus except when people taunt him while holding up a lightning rod in the middle of a thunderstorm. They are separate from us of today. We cannot worship them, even if non-charlatan druids existed. If God moves about our times and people, then we must worship him. I have seen miracles, people healed after praying, and others hurt after a blasphemous oath. I have seen heretics and wicked men like Popov and Osteen revealed for their wicked lies. We have his book and his knowledge. The historical record gives us much proof of Jesus' existence. Until our modern times, people did not doubt that Jesus lived and died, even if they spouted heresy to subvert it. People understood that Christ ruled and interceded for us. Christians do not need priest-kings with Christ enthroned. Kings like St. Louis understood their role. He was not a priest. He was a king who was responsible to God as any average man, woman, and child was. More so, he knew he was as responsible for the people as any king of old, and any king that was to come. He worshipped the Lord, prayed for his sins and the sins of his nation, built churches, laid on hands, performed charity, and so on. But at no point did he do this work as a member of the priest class. He did it because he was the king. And as the king, he had responsibilities to fulfill, which he did so well. He was like David. He worshipped the Lord. He did not charge into the temple to make his own sacrifice. Christ, when he removed the barriers from our relationship with his Father, became the perfect priest, and the imperfect priests were rebuked throughout his ministry and with his death. Is it so strange that he spoke out against the Pharisees, but he paid taxes to Rome? If we seek God, it must be through Christ, and not through the strange parade of dead and conquered gods. The West's priest class has lost its divine right to serve God since the 1970s. Our kings lost it in World War I. We can now see that the West has crumbled, even as Christendom has declined. Francis Schaeffer spoke of it in his works. Evola is discussing it now. People all around the internet are talking about it. I am talking about it in this video. It is a digital priest class arguing about everything except that which is worth arguing about, whether or not it is worth it to serve Christ above all and in defiance of this fallen world. Christ is king, Christ is high priest. Christ took the position that Evola describes the ancient pharaohs and other kings taking. It is Christ's blood that is sufficient to preserve us from hell. All the wisdom of man's relationship to the gods is an attempt to answer whether or not we are worthy of going before them. Once one's sins are wiped away by Christ's blood, we are truly worthy. I want to give a big thank you to Academic Agent for Evola Day. I really hope you enjoyed this video and it gave you some things to think about. And if anyone has an answer to the statement I posed above, I would love to hear it. Thank you and have a good night.